This is also a time of change for my family.
The decision did not arrive through gossip, ceremony, or a carefully rehearsed palace announcement. It came inside a sealed royal order, placed directly before Queen Camilla. King Charles had made his choice. Her entire Sapphire Tiara collection was to be removed from her control and transferred to Princess Anne. As Camilla read the final line, the room fell silent, and the Queen Consort slowly lowered the document without saying a word. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles remained standing across from her, his face controlled, and his silence heavier than any explanation he could have offered. The final royal directive, a written command carrying the monarch's authority, ordered every sapphire tiara, necklace, brooch, and matching piece to be catalogued, removed from Camilla's private custody, and placed under Anne's care. These were not merely expensive jewels. They carried royal rank, ceremonial meaning, family memory, and public proof of the Queen Consort's place beside the king. Camilla reached the transfer date, and her expression hardened. She looked up at her husband, searching for hesitation, regret, anything suggesting the decision could still be softened. He gave her nothing. The order went further. One unusual clause barred her from borrowing, displaying, gifting, or privately reclaiming any sapphire piece after the transfer. A senior courtier later described the wording in a documented palace account, noting that Charles had used language normally reserved for crown-controlled property, items treated as belonging to the monarchy rather than one individual. The implication was devastating. The king no longer appeared to regard the collection as something his wife could personally command. Camilla understood it instantly, and the pain behind her stillness turned into anger. Anne received the news in a separate private briefing and felt no victory. The Princess Royal knew accepting the collection might protect the crown, yet it would also place her inside her brother's wounded marriage. She asked whether Charles had spoken to Camilla himself. When told that he had, Anne closed the file and stared at the table, aware that duty had made her the symbol of another woman's loss. Camilla finally rose. She placed the order down with deliberate care, turned toward Charles, and asked one cold question. Was this Anne's idea? The king did not answer. That silence changed the transfer from an institutional decision into something personal, leaving all three of them on the edge of a conflict no jewel could contain. But to understand why one collection of blue stones could divide a marriage, wound a sister, and shake the monarchy, the people standing behind the order had to be understood first. To the public, the transfer appeared to concern diamonds, sapphires, and royal ownership. Inside the family, it concerned something far more dangerous: trust. Charles saw the jewels as symbols of responsibility. Camilla saw them as proof that she had finally been accepted. Anne saw them as a burden she had never requested. And beneath their formal titles stood three aging siblings and spouses, confronting years of loyalty, resentment, sacrifice, and unspoken disappointment. Charles had spent years defending Camilla's place beside him, absorbing criticism, resisting pressure, and insisting that the woman he loved belonged at the heart of the monarchy. That history made the order feel brutal, because it appeared to reverse part of the security he had once built around her. The monarchy, meaning the royal institution that continues beyond any one person, depended on symbols being protected from private claims. Yet the king knew those symbols had also become emotional proof that his wife had finally been accepted. Camilla stood alone before a mirror and touched the empty place where a sapphire tiara had rested during a recent fitting. Her anger slowly collapsed into humiliation. She understood how the transfer would be read, not as careful stewardship, but as rejection. Worse, she discovered through a documented briefing note that William had been informed before she was. The future king's involvement confirmed that this was succession planning, the preparation for how royal duties and possessions passed to the next reign, not merely a quarrel between husband and wife. Anne carried the burden differently. She told Sir Timothy Lawrence in a private conversation that she did not want the collection and had never asked for it. The Princess Royal, a title given to the monarch's eldest daughter, had built her reputation on duty, discretion, and emotional restraint. Charles trusted her precisely because she would protect politically sensitive jewels without treating them as personal trophies. Still, she feared Camilla would hate her for accepting them, while refusing them might leave her brother completely isolated. The tension deepened when Anne admitted that Charles had approached her months earlier. During a recorded family discussion, he had asked whether she would safeguard certain royal jewels in a future family emergency, though he never named Camilla. Now the meaning was impossible to miss. Inside the transfer file, a handwritten date pointed back to one ceremony, one evening, and one decision the king had never forgiven. Camilla saw the date and froze, because she remembered exactly what she had worn, what Charles had warned, and what followed afterward. The order may have been signed in silence, but its true beginning lay in a crowded royal reception where one private exchange changed everything. Every royal rupture has a moment that later appears inevitable. For this family, it came during a state reception at Windsor Castle, beneath music, polished smiles, and carefully observed protocol. Camilla entered wearing a sapphire tiara that Charles had specifically asked her not to use. What followed was not a public scandal, but a private confrontation behind closed doors, and a sentence from Camilla that the king would remember when he signed the final order. Weeks earlier, Charles had made one request. The most historically sensitive sapphire tiara was to remain unworn until its ownership and succession status had been reviewed. A state reception, meaning a royal gathering for important national guests, demanded discipline because every choice carried institutional meaning. Camilla heard the request differently. After years of defending her loyalty and enduring judgment, she believed palace officials were once again placing limits around her position. The Queen Consort felt controlled before the evening had even begun. Camilla made her answer without announcing it. She entered the Windsor reception wearing the restricted tiara, forcing Charles to greet her in public while hiding the anger beneath his composure. The king smiled, spoke to guests, and performed every duty expected of him, yet he barely looked at his wife. She understood the warning in his silence, but she refused to retreat. That evening, the sapphire became more than a jewel. It became a challenge. The doors closed after the final guests departed. Charles followed her into an adjoining chamber and demanded to know why she had ignored him. Camilla removed one glove, placed it on the table, and told him she would not spend the rest of her life asking permission to look like a queen. He stared at her, stunned less by the defiance than by what it revealed. She no longer saw his request as protection. She saw it as humiliation. Anne heard the raised voices while approaching the room, but stopped before entering. Later, she found her brother alone, holding the tiara's archival file, a record explaining its ownership, history, and permitted use, with visibly shaking hands. In a documented family account, the Princess Royal recalled that Charles said only, "She has made this impossible." The danger deepened during the next inventory. Camilla had asked whether 2 sapphire pieces could eventually pass to members of her own family, raising fears that royal assets might drift outside the direct line of succession. Charles responded by summoning both women to a meeting without advisors. No courtiers, no protection, only the truth. The ceremony created the wound, but the private meeting that followed would force Charles to choose between protecting his wife's dignity and defending the boundaries of the crown. There were no private secretaries, no legal advisors, and no courtiers to soften the language. Charles sat at one end of the room, Camilla opposite him, and Anne between them, not as a judge, but as the reluctant recipient of a collection already tearing the family apart. The confrontation began quietly. Then Camilla pushed her chair backwards, looked directly at the king, and accused him of using his sister to punish his wife. Charles did not raise his voice. He told her the transfer concerned stewardship, succession, and crown security, not affection. Stewardship meant protecting royal property for those who would come after them, while succession governed how authority and responsibility passed to the next reign. The king insisted that historically significant jewels could not be controlled by personal loyalty alone. Camilla heard only rejection. She reminded him that he had spent years lifting her into public acceptance, defending her place, and asking the country to recognize her as his partner. Now, in private, He was stripping away the very symbols that had made that acceptance feel real. Her voice broke for a moment. Then it hardened. Anne leaned forward and made her position clear. She had not requested the collection, helped draft the order, or encouraged Charles to remove anything from Camilla. The Princess Royal, the title traditionally given to the monarch's eldest daughter, wanted no personal victory and no feud with her sister-in-law. Yet the Queen Consort turned toward her and asked why she had agreed to accept the jewels at all. Anne answered that refusing them would not undo the decision. It would only leave the collection exposed and her brother isolated. Camilla faced Charles again. She revealed, through a recorded private exchange later preserved in a family account, that she knew William had reviewed the transfer plan before she was informed. The future king's involvement changed everything. She demanded to know whether her position was already being reduced before her husband's reign had even ended. Charles replied that the Windsor incident had destroyed his confidence. She had worn the disputed tiara after a direct request not to do so. What began as disagreement had become defiance. Anne placed both hands on the table and told Camilla the greatest danger was not losing the jewels. It was allowing the family to appear incapable of protecting what belonged to the institution. Silence followed. Charles set down his pen and said the order would stand. Then he added that another authority, buried inside the collection's legal history, had already made reversal nearly impossible. Camilla had confronted the king as his wife, yet the power behind the transfer reached beyond marriage and into the machinery that decides what even a queen may truly possess. A royal jewel can rest on one woman's head, while legally, historically, and symbolically belonging to something much larger. That distinction became the weapon Charles could not ignore. Behind the emotional confrontation stood inventories, accession records, family settlements, and precedents reaching across generations. Yet the decisive moment remained painfully human. The king sitting alone at his desk, reading Camilla's original jewel agreements before drawing a line beneath one clause. Charles studied the records long after the palace had fallen quiet. Some sapphire pieces were linked directly to royal office, meaning they served the crown rather than the private wishes of the person wearing them. Others sat inside family settlements, written arrangements controlling how important possessions could pass between generations, while a final group remained under the sovereign's personal but regulated stewardship. The monarch could redirect their custody when their future use threatened continuity, inheritance, or public trust. That authority gave him power. It did not give him peace. The king paused over Camilla's signature from years earlier. He remembered the confidence with which she had accepted the original terms and the loyalty he believed those terms represented. Now the same page exposed how far their trust had fallen. His hand remained on the paper until William entered quietly and saw the grief in his father's face. The prince asked whether the transfer was truly necessary. Charles answered without looking up. Love could not become an exemption from responsibility. William understood the sentence was aimed at more than jewels. It was the monarch judging his own marriage. Anne's role carried a limit few outside the room understood. She would not receive unrestricted ownership or the freedom to wear, gift, or divide the collection. The Princess Royal would serve only as custodian, a guardian required to preserve the pieces for future sovereign use and prevent any private reassignment. Charles had also added a sealed succession instruction, a confidential direction governing how royal property would serve the next reign. Selected sapphires would eventually become available to Catherine and Charlotte, securing them inside the direct royal line. Camilla received the final notice before breakfast. The first cases would be opened and removed the following morning. She read the time twice, then placed the page beside her untouched tea. Until that moment, the transfer had remained language, signatures, and threats hidden inside files. Now strangers would enter her rooms, lift away the symbols she had worn beside Charles, and carry them toward Anne. The order had become physical, permanent, unavoidable, and final. The decision had been defended through duty and precedent. But when the jewel cases were finally opened, no legal wording could protect the family from the emotional cost. At 8:09, 2 royal collection officers entered the dressing suite, carrying an inventory ledger and empty protective cases. Camilla was already there. She had dismissed her attendants and arranged the sapphire pieces herself, placing each one carefully on the table as though preparing for a final audience. When the first tiara was lifted away, she did not object. She simply turned her wedding ring once around her finger and stared toward the closed door. Camilla watched as every piece entered the formal removal process. Each tiara, necklace, brooch, and matching jewel was inspected, photographed, recorded, sealed, and prepared for transfer into Anne's designated custody. The royal collection, meaning the body responsible for preserving objects connected to the monarchy, treated each item as part of a continuing inheritance rather than a private possession. The work remained deliberately quiet because Charles wanted to prevent public humiliation. Even so, household staff noticed unfamiliar officers moving through restricted corridors, and whispers began before the first case had left the room. The Queen Consort said little until one sapphire tiara was lowered into a lined box. Then she told an officer, almost under her breath, that she had worn it during one of the happiest evenings of the king's reign. The officer paused, but Camilla gave a small nod and allowed the lid to close. That gesture revealed the true cost. The jewels were not only symbols of rank, they carried memories of public acceptance, private triumph, and the years she believed had finally secured her place beside Charles. Silence remained after the officers departed. Camilla refused breakfast and stayed alone in the emptied room, her anger replaced by something more painful. Charles had expected her to surrender every piece, yet he had not come to witness the removal. The king's absence told her that he could defend the order in law, but could not bear to watch what it did to his wife. Anne received the sealed cases hours later, and immediately refused to have them taken into her private rooms. The princess ordered everything placed inside a secure archive, a protected storage area used for important royal property. She would not turn Camilla's loss into her own victory. Beneath one necklace, an officer discovered a handwritten note. It read, "Jewels cannot create loyalty, and removing them cannot restore it." Anne read the message twice. Then she ignored the formal response prepared by officials and chose to visit Camilla herself, carrying neither the sapphire collection nor Charles's instructions. The cases had changed hands, but the conflict would not turn until the two women finally faced one another, without Charles, protocol, or the crown standing between them. Anne arrived without an equerry, private secretary, or written message from the king. Camilla opened the door herself, and, for several seconds, neither woman spoke. There were no jewels between them now, only the consequences of years spent serving the same monarchy in profoundly different ways. Then Anne placed Camilla's handwritten note on the table and said the one thing the Queen Consort had not expected: "I did not come to defend the order." Camilla remained standing, guarded and uncertain. Anne explained that she had accepted custody because refusing would have deepened Charles's crisis and left the collection in a more politically vulnerable position. An equerry, meaning a royal aide who assists with official duties, would normally have accompanied her, but the princess had wanted no institutional barrier between them. She also made one promise clear: the sapphires would remain sealed, except for approved state occasions, and she had no intention of wearing the pieces most closely associated with Camilla. The Queen Consort finally sat down. She admitted that losing the collection was not the deepest wound. What hurt most was being treated as though she might damage the institution she had spent years helping Charles preserve. She had endured public hostility, defended the king through difficult moments, and believed that loyalty had earned her trust. Now the order suggested the opposite. Anne listened without interruption, then answered with painful honesty. Camilla's defiance at Windsor had frightened Charles, because it suggested his wife no longer recognized the line between personal validation and royal duty. Anne softened only after the truth had landed. She offered a compromise the king had never requested. Camilla could prepare a written history of every sapphire piece, recording where she had worn it, what each occasion meant, and how the collection had shaped her years beside Charles. The official archive, a permanent record preserving the history and use of royal property, would hold those memories alongside the legal documents. Her name would remain attached to the collection, even if control did not. Camilla looked at the handwritten note between them and finally admitted what she had resisted. Asking whether 2 royal sapphires might one day pass to members of her own family had created an appearance she should have understood. She insisted she had never intended to remove them improperly, but she accepted that intention alone could not erase the damage. The 2 women did not embrace, and nothing was restored. Yet something shifted. Resentment gave way to recognition. Outside the palace, however, the sealed transfer was already beginning to leak, and the public was about to decide what this private reckoning truly meant. Behind the closed door, resentment gave way to recognition. Yet beyond those walls, the world was about to turn a private royal reckoning into a national judgment. By sunrise, the royal transfer was no longer a palace secret. One newspaper covered its entire front page with a photograph of Camilla wearing the disputed sapphire tiara beneath the words, "Charles takes back the blue crown." Broadcasters called it the most personal royal intervention of his reign. Outside Buckingham Palace, a crowd gathered beneath the gates, some praising Anne's duty, others calling the decision a calculated humiliation of the king's wife. Camilla watched the morning coverage without speaking. The transfer had now been formally confirmed under Charles's signed authority, placing the sapphire collection in Anne's custodial control. Custodial control meant responsibility for protecting and managing the jewels without treating them as personal property. That distinction mattered because the dispute was no longer about a marriage. It was about whether royal treasures belonged to the people who wore them or to the continuing institution they served. The Queen Consort kept her eyes on the screen as commentators argued over what the decision meant. Some called it constitutional discipline. Others described it as a public stripping of status. When an image appeared of her wearing the disputed tiara beside the king, she reached for the remote and turned the television off. The silence afterward felt worse. Charles saw the same broadcast and realized that safeguards he had designed in private had become a wound exposed before the country. He asked an aide whether Camilla had eaten or spoken to anyone that morning. The answer was no. Anne faced a different kind of judgment. A broadcaster revealed, through a documented palace briefing, that she had ordered every transferred piece to remain sealed and had forbidden their use for her own appearances. The Princess Royal's instruction changed the story. What had looked like triumph now appeared to be reluctant guardianship. She was not taking Camilla's place. She was carrying a burden the king believed could no longer remain where it had been. The palace then issued a worded statement confirming that the sapphires would be preserved for future generations. The statement did not mention the family conflict, but it validated the succession concerns behind Charles's action. Public anger did not vanish, yet the meaning shifted. The order was permanent. The humiliation was real. So was the duty behind it. Charles understood that silence could no longer repair what silence had helped create. He made one final private decision, not to reverse the transfer, but to acknowledge what it had cost Camilla and what Anne had sacrificed by accepting it. The public had delivered its arguments, but the true verdict would come from the family itself when Charles faced the 2 women whose loyalty had carried the monarchy through the crisis. The sapphire collection was never returned to Camilla. Charles did not withdraw the order. Anne did not reject the responsibility, and the palace did not disguise what had happened. Yet the final meaning of the transfer was not written inside an inventory or sealed beneath royal authority. It emerged during one last meeting, when Charles apologized for the pain he had caused without apologizing for protecting the crown, and Camilla finally accepted the difference. Charles brought the 2 women together after the public storm and made one truth unmistakable. The transfer was permanent. Anne would remain custodian, meaning the person legally trusted to protect the collection without owning it for private use. Historically significant pieces would stay available to future sovereigns, while Camilla's handwritten histories would enter the official archive, the permanent record preserving how royal objects were used and remembered. The king placed those pages beside the sealed directive and told his wife that changed custody could not erase years of service. Camilla answered without anger. She said she would not pretend the decision had not wounded her, because the sapphires had become tied to the security she had spent years trying to earn. Still, The Queen Consort admitted that her desire to control the collection had become tangled with her fear of losing status. The confession changed the room. She was no longer defending possession. She was naming the insecurity that had driven her toward it. Anne spoke next. She promised that the sapphires would never be worn or displayed to humiliate Camilla. The Princess Royal would guard them as part of the monarchy's inheritance, not as proof of another woman's defeat. Charles then thanked his sister for accepting a burden that had exposed her to anger from inside the family, and judgment from outside it. He admitted that duty had demanded more from Anne than any transfer paper could record. For once, none of them looked toward the documents for protection. They looked at one another, understanding that survival now depended on restraint, not victory alone. The final verdict was clear. Camilla lost unrestricted authority over the sapphires, but she did not lose her marriage, her service, or her place beside Charles. The king preserved the institution. Anne protected the inheritance, and Camilla finally accepted that royal belonging could not be proved through possession. When the final case was sealed, the monarchy had not chosen Anne over Camilla. It had chosen continuity over ownership, responsibility over pride, and a painful honesty that allowed 3 wounded people to remain a family. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.